So with that, let me introduce our first keynote for the day. This is again the person who needs no introduction. Charles Jennings is a well-known name in our industry. He's one of the greatest thought leaders that I've looked up to when I started at CAST and didn't know anything about this space. I think one of the first things that I read was the 70-20-10 rule or the whole philosophy and the framework from Charles. And I just couldn't resist to reach out to him because to me, he felt like the father of this whole industry. So Charles Jennings was the head of UK's National Centre for Network-Based Learning in the 80s and the 90s. He was the head of learning and head of strategic technology at Dow Jones and head of learning at Reuters before that. He's obviously well known for his work on 70-20-10. I'm sure many organizations around the world have been using or actually implementing his work. And he's currently working at both the 70-20-10 Institute as well as with TULSER Global. So with that, welcome, Charles.
Thank you very much, Carl. Okay, great. Thanks very much, Carl. It's really appreciated. It's a real pleasure to be speaking at the beginning of day 2 for this Future of Work Summit. And Carl's mentioned about the hyper change, the hyper everything that we're going through at the moment. And I want to focus around integrating learning with working, but I particularly want to focus on change because, you know, we all experience change and we need to not be led by change, but we need to actually be part of the change. And change is quite difficult. And so I want to look forward by initially looking back. And first of all, this man I've always held very highly in esteem for the whole of my life. George Bernard Shaw is, until 5 years ago, he was the only person to have won both a Nobel Prize and an Oscar. Then Bob Dylan came along in 2016 and got his Nobel Prize. So there's 2 of them. But I think Bernard Shaw really hits the nail on the head here. He talks about progress being impossible without change, and that those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. So in other words, what Bernard Shaw was saying was that change is more than just having a change program or going through a set of processes. It's about some fundamental, deep, often challenging changes in terms of our mindset. And I want to go back a little further and give this example around the difficulties of embedding change in an organization. I want to step us all back 400 years to James Lancaster, Admiral Sir James Lancaster, who was appointed by the first Queen Elizabeth in England to be her envoy to the Far East. And he was the commander of the East India's First Fleet. Now, Lancaster was a very interesting man. He wasn't just a naval man, but he was also very interested in science. And in 1601, he was commissioned to take a flotilla of vessels from Torbay in the south of England, not very far from where I'm speaking to you today, from Torbay in England, around the Cape of Good Hope and up to India. And Lancaster had some ideas about one of the major problems that naval people were suffering at that time, which we now know as scurvy. Lancaster had worked in Madagascar and various places, and he'd realized that there was potentially some use of citrus fruits, in other words, vitamin C, as we know now, to combat scurvy. So in 1601, he decided to carry out a little experiment, well, a small sample experiment. He was commanding a flotilla of 4 vessels to go to India. And he decided that on one vessel, he would prescribe 3 teaspoons of lemon juice every day for the crew. That happened to be his vessel. The other vessels did nothing. By the time they reached the halfway point, what is now Cape Town in South Africa, 110 men out of the 278 in the other 3 ships had died. In other words, a 40% mortality rate. This wasn't unusual. Not only that, the others who were surviving were so weak that Lancaster had to turn his vessel out and help others into port. On his ship, no one died. So when he came back from India to England, he reported back to his superiors at the English Admiralty and reported this result. And the English Admiralty took action. However, they took action it took them 194 years to take action. Now, in that intervening time, it wasn't just Lancaster's research, but lots of other pieces of research were carried out to show that vitamin C or lemon juice and citrus fruit seemed to drive off scurvy. So 194 years, the English Navy actually enacted guidelines for lemon or lime juice. So that was not due to the lack of evidence. It was due to mindset change and other things. And then, just to round it off, it took another 70 years for the British Board of Trade, because between 1795 and 1865, England had joined with Scotland, Wales, and Ireland to become Britain, to the British Board of Trade to say, well, if this works for naval men, maybe sailors on merchant vessels have the same problem. So this bit of change took 264 years. I hope that none of us are going to be involved in change that is likely to take that long. So bringing it back to our own sphere of work, our own sphere of influence, I want to talk about change and what I would call beyond formal learning in the workflow. Now, those of you that heard Josh Burson speak yesterday morning, Josh talked about learning in the workflow, and mainly he was referring to what I call formal learning in the workflow. So how we take formal learning and make sure that we make that available to people when they need it, where they need it. But that is just one aspect of the whole panoply of learning in the workflow. So why should we even think about this? Because if we're going to move from essentially being professionals who are designing, developing, and delivering training, for want of a better word, to help people, to actually moving to embedding learning as part of workflow, there's got to be a good reason for it. Well, there are some very good reasons for it. First of all, we know that most learning actually occurs in the workflow. This bit of data comes from the European Research Centre for Education and the Labour Market, which determined that when we look about time, around about 96% of time spent learning actually happens in the workflow, and about 4% of time occurs away from the daily flow of work. Now, there's some very good reasons for this, and if you just look at this data, you can see why that is. Now, the ATD annually produces its State of the Industry report, and it reports the formal learning hours used per employee. I speak to many people, and they talk about how many hours per employee, how many hours do employees learn each year? Well, of course, formally, we know the data. Informally, it's a lot more. There's a huge opportunity there. But if you look at this data on the left here, now this figure only goes up to 2017. 2018, the data was slightly lower. 2019, it was higher. And I'm expecting the 2020 data is just being aggregated at the moment, it to be higher still. But basically, when we look at the ATD's data sets, they separate data into what they call their best companies, those companies that are really focused on supporting their employees with learning resources. And it's round about 50 hours a year. Average companies, round about 35 hours a year. So when we put that beside the average annual hours worked by people, and here's the OECD data, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development data, for 2020 for a few countries. I've just put Mexico in there because it's the highest. And the USA, you can see there is 1,767. In fact, the number of hours, annual hours worked per worker in the USA has only dropped ever so slightly since 2010, in the last decade. But, and the UK is down below, and Germany, which is notorious for its efficiency, actually workers work fewer hours. But if you just do a simple calculation, you can see that the number of hours that we have for formal learning is very, very small, maybe 2 to 4% of the number of hours we spend working. And researchers have shown that white-collar workers, their work provides opportunities for learning maybe about 25% of the time, and about 20% of the time for blue-collar workers are opportunities for learning. So there is a huge space opportunity for us to start to think about how we integrate learning with working. And just to a final point on this, that Professor Andreas de Grip who's the director of the European Research Centre for Education and Labour Market, has pointed out that recent studies find that even when people are starting work, even newly hired workers, their performance is driven principally by learning by doing or learning from peers and supervisors. And therefore, this learning that he calls informal learning rather than workplace learning, this sort of learning is actually more important for development than formal learning. So the answer isn't one or the other. The answer is we need to do both. We need to extend our learning approaches and our learning activities so that we're actually embedding them in work. And we also know that not all workplace learning is actually equal. And this bit of research, which was looking at the extent to which workers learn depending on job task. And again, this isn't a surprise to anyone, I'm sure. So that things such as new and challenging activities are really great opportunities for learning. Cooperating with more experienced colleagues or working and helping less experienced colleagues are great opportunities for learning. But even daily routine activities, and God help us, even sitting in meetings are opportunities for us to learn. So we need to be looking beyond the formal learning into how we can exploit this learning in the workplace. And again, I'd step back and think about and take some advice from another great economist, Kenneth Arrow, who has spent his career at Stanford University, won his Nobel Prize for economics back in 1972. Arrow spent a lot of time looking at the economic implications of learning through working and learning by doing, as he called it. And of course, other Stanford academics such as Bob Sutton and people like Jeff Pfeffer and others with their knowing doing gap work have also reiterated this, in that learning is a product of experience, and learning really only takes place through an attempt to solve a problem, as Arrow said, and therefore only takes place during activity. So by integrating and bringing learning into the workplace, into the flow of work, not necessarily by just lifting our courses and programs, but by really integrating it into the flow of work, is a huge opportunity to make learning more effective. And we've known this for years and years and years. So if I can roll back again, 100 years this year, 1901, these two gentlemen, very eminent American psychologists, Edward Thorndike and Robert Woodworth. Thorndike and Woodworth formulated a theory called the theory of identical elements, or what they call the transfer of practice. And their theory, which still holds today, is that the more elements in the environment in which you learn something is with the environment where you're going to use that learning, the more effective the learning is likely to be. And we've seen a whole industry build up around transfer of learning. We all know it, all professionals in learning and development are aware of the whole issue of transfer. And Thorndike and Woodworth simply said, okay, if you make sure that where people learn things is as near as the environment in which they're going to use it, the learning is going to be more effective. So we've known these things for a long, long time. And the challenge with change is, how do we actually change our mindsets, and how do we start to get to do it in a practical way? So I just want to finish off really by talking about 3 different types of learning connected to work that my colleagues and I use, and we included it in a design principle in a book we wrote 6 years ago called 70-20-10 Towards 100% Performance. But the work is actually based on earlier work from people like Gloria Geary, who's famously with her electronic performance support systems back 30 years ago, and the Corporate Executive Board and others have done work around this. And I just want to talk about these 3 different types: adding, embedding, and extracting. How can we add learning to work? How can we embed learning in work? And how can we extract learning from work? So if you can think of it in this way, when we in the learning context, we are providing learning services and helping people learn in order to work. So when we add learning to work, we extend that into the workplace, which is really, really good. It enriches the learning experience. It's where we design learning and then we help them be carried out in the workplace. And most, for example, most leadership programs and management programs do this as a matter of course these days. learning from work is still focused on learning. Usually the measurements are still learning metrics. And they're what we would call, I guess, blended learning, or we would call 10 plus. I'm often asked to review maybe programs or courses, and people say, you know, we're using 70-20-10 in this. And actually, when we look at it, we say, well, that's great. It's really good formal learning that's extending and utilizing the workplace. But it isn't moving very much into the work and business context. So that's adding learning to work. The second perspective is where we embed learning with work. So learning and working become two sides of the coin. Inevitably, these are focused on performance because we're usually looking at how do we carry out these set of tasks or these tasks. The measures we use are performance measures. So we know it's working because performance can be improved or enhanced, problems can be overcome, and so on. And embedding learning for work is really providing support to help people do their jobs when they need. And that may be in everything from a simple checklist to some more complex performance support. There's quite a lot of embedded performance support in terms of supporting system and process based learning nowadays. So that's where we embed learning within the workflow. And the third of these three types is what we would call extracting learning from work, where the model is we work, we learn within work, and we get better, we work better. And that's totally embedded in the working business context. It's performance focused, it's where we're working with others, we move away from just individual performance and start to look at, well, we absolutely look at team performance and organizational performance. It's focused on collaboration, cooperation. It's focused on helping people learn from their normal activities. And underpinning all of this is continuous improvement cycles, which is why I always prefer to talk about creating cultures of continuous improvement rather than creating cultures of learning, because when you talk about creating cultures of learning, people often take that to mean we need just to have more courses and more learning. Whereas when we talk about creating cultures of continuous improvement, we're talking about the outcomes of learning. How can we make sure that we're producing some impact? So I'd just like to give some practical advice around how we might integrate learning with working. And the first bit of advice is always start with the organizational outcomes. In other words, what I would describe as working inside out. So when we are asked to provide some learning solutions, the first thing we should ask is what are the organizational outcomes going to be? All of us have been in a situation, I'm sure, where a senior manager or a senior leader has come to us and said, we need a new course on XYZ. We need a new first level manager program or a sales program or whatever. And the first question we need to ask is, what is going to be the improved organizational outcome? What opportunity are we taking, or what deficiency are we addressing? Because if you don't know where you're going, you don't know where to start. And so this model of simply providing a formal learning program because it's always been done before or because someone has asked for it is not going to lead to high performance. It's not going to get us that change that we really need to have. And this model, and I'm not going to spend too much time looking at this, but this is a model that we use and we've published in this particular book we wrote. I think explains it quite well. We start on the right-hand side. So we start with what the organizational results we're looking for. And from that, we distill it down to the critical tasks. So what are those critical tasks that need to be undertaken in order to achieve those results? And equally, what are the environmental factors or the influencing factors which are affecting the performance of those tasks? And then we design our solutions based on, as we say, design for the 100, start with the 70. So what can we do within the workflow that we can help people to achieve what they need to do, and how do they do it through, whether it's through learning through working, whether it's learning with others, or in some cases it may be learning through some formal structured programs. And we measure that right from the beginning. So we set our metrics as terms of the organizational metrics, and we work back. And that's really the critical approach. And I think it's a very different approach to what certainly over my career, what much of learning and development has been done, where we start with, on the other side, so we start with the formal learning and then we build it out into the workplace. So we're starting with the organizational outcomes and we're building back. And so when we do this, we also have to think about building L&D bench strength, our professional capabilities around this. And when we're looking at that, we need to go beyond thinking about learning, beyond about fixing people, and beyond about upskilling, although all of those are important. We need to think about how do we solve business problems? How do we add business value? And how do we embed systemic change and continuous improvement in what we do? And again, we've defined at the 70-20-10 Institute, defined 5 roles that can help us do that. So we can basically repurpose and reskill and change the processes used by learning and development into analyzing the performance, in other words, a performance detective, architecting solutions, building them, making sure that they're embedded in the culture of the organization, and making sure we're measuring the right stuff. So I'd just like to finish off, and before we go on through the rest of the day, with a couple of quotes. This one by my colleague Jos Arets, who has done a huge amount of work over the years in terms of linking and embedding learning with working. And Jos said this to me a few years ago, which I thought it really struck a chord for me. He said, learning is simply the intelligent byproduct of continuous improvement. So if we think simply about learning, we're missing a trick. We need to think about continuous improvement, and learning is the learning that comes out of that process of continuous improvement. That's the value of learning. It's not around just focusing on making sure that people know stuff. It's making sure that people get better continuously at doing things. And out of that comes learning. And when we look at it from an organizational perspective, it's really clear that that's the case. And finally, I'd like to go way back to the Roman Ovid back in 43 BCE, and also to Aldous Huxley. And Ovid, this is a quote from Ovid, which is translated to English below, which Huxley has used. And Huxley, we all know from his Brave New World treatise. And that is, I see the better and I approve, but I pursue the worse. Now, I'm not suggesting that any of us follow that adage in a thoughtful way, but often we get trapped into seeing what we can do to change things. But we find that the barriers to change are just too damn hard. So one thing I really would hope, and one message I would really like to convey, is that we should be able to see the better and aim for it and work towards it. Because if we continue to do what we've always been doing, we're going to get what we've always got. And because change is all about us, we're going to, in that case, just be carried along with the change rather than actually leading the change. So I hope you have a really good second day at this event. And Carl, once again, thanks very much for inviting me to share with everyone.
Thank you, Charles. That was amazing and always very fascinating insights from you. I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind staying a few minutes.
Certainly.
So the first question obviously comes from this, the 70-20-10 is a framework that now, we've heard and been implemented at hundreds, thousands of places across the world. And we are in this world of data-driven outcomes, and we had a really good session yesterday about data-driven outcomes. We also had a session where Gianni from Genpact actually did endorse many things that you mentioned today about creating that tacit knowledge and how he creates a guru network within 100,000 people of Genpact. So we had some great stories yesterday that endorsed many of the successes of the 70-20-10. But based on your experience of working with large corporates, has any data that has come out that you would like to share? Because we are living in this world of all this data, and we try to share as much data as we can, and then our customers and our prospects and people in this community always keep asking for data. So what kind of data that you can share that supports your philosophy and the framework, or even some data that shows that you may want to tweak it? Maybe the 70-20-10 became 80-20 or something like that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
You may want to, yeah. So
sure, Carl, and absolutely. I mean, 70-20-10 is Bob Eichinger, who actually came up with the original term from the Center for Creative Leadership. And I won't give you the whole history, but Bob calls it a meme. And I think it probably is a meme. I've always referred to it as a framework. And that if you're focused on the numbers, you're not really thinking about it in the right way, because I've always seen 70-20-10 as being an instrument to help us extend our thinking and practices for learning. So rather than, we all know that learning, having good, solid, structured learning programs and learning activities is really helpful. But that's just part of the picture. And I've always seen 70-20-10 as a way to help everyone get away from sort of just painting in the bottom left-hand corner and say, well, there's a whole canvas here that we can work to. In terms of data, there's a lot of evidence that shows that, and again, I'd go back to Ken Arrow's, one of Ken Arrow's students, Joseph Stiglitz, who still writes for the New York Times. And he, again, has written a wonderful book around creating a learning society. And Stiglitz has produced data, or the economists have shown data, that you learn by doing things, and by doing things you get better. And there's all sorts of examples of huge improvements in terms of productivity by simply doing things better. And W. Edwards Deming, I guess, is a great example. Again, if you go and look at the changes brought about in Japan post-Second World War that Deming, with his quality movement, drove, there's a huge amount of data that shows that by continuous improvement, we get better. And we learn from that. And even in my small way, when I was Chief Learning Officer at Reuters and we first implemented 70-20-10 as a strategy starting in 2001, between in the 8 years that I was at Reuters, the impact in terms of everything from share price to customer satisfaction levels to the cost. We didn't aim to reduce the cost of training, but it certainly went down. But all these things were absolutely clear, some very, very hard data. And I've seen it in many companies, many organizations. So there's lots of data outside there, out there to have a look at. So
no, that's great, and we would love to kind of speak with you outside of the conference and get some of that data. The one you mentioned, which really would resonate with all the CEOs and Wall Street, is that the increase in the share price that correlates with the learning organization.
I would say. Let me put a caveat on that, Carl. I wouldn't claim that my team was responsible.
Yeah, all the CHRO and CLO community here, they will get their funding from their CFO very quickly if we show that correlation to the share price. So that'll be great.
Yeah, I've always said that we weren't part of the. I'm sorry, just to finish. I've always said that we weren't necessarily responsible for the increase in share price, but we weren't part of the problem. We were part of the solution.
Right. Perfect. Great. Thank you, Charles. Appreciate it, and we look forward to reconnecting with you soon.
A real pleasure. Okay.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Welcome.